The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the intimate anniversary dinner table. But the romantic ambiance shattered the moment Derek slid the divorce papers across the white linen tablecloth toward his wife Emma. His mistress Vanessa laughed from the adjacent table, her champagne glass raised in mockery, completely unaware that the humiliated woman before her was actually the trillionaire owner of the company signing Derek's $8.4 billion deal. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the papers, but before she could process the betrayal, Derek's mother Patricia stormed over, her palm connecting with Emma's cheek in a resounding slap that silenced the entire restaurant. "You'll sign those papers right now, you worthless gold digger," Patricia hissed, grabbing Emma by her arm and physically dragging her toward the exit for refusing to sign immediately. Emma stumbled outside into the cold night air, her designer dress torn at the shoulder, but instead of breaking down, she pulled out her phone and made a single call that would change everything. Within hours, Derek's career lay in ruins, his $8.4 billion deal evaporated like morning mist, and both he and his mother found themselves washing dishes in the very restaurant where they'd tried to destroy her. Their expensive clothes replaced with stained aprons, their arrogance replaced with the crushing weight of consequences they never saw coming. But who was Emma really? And how did a woman who appeared so vulnerable wield such devastating power? What did that phone call contain? And why were Derek and Patricia now scrubbing plates instead of celebrating their victory? And most importantly, what hidden truth about Emma's identity had they been too blind to see until it was far too late? Dear viewers, this story will take you on a powerful journey about hidden identities, the consequences of arrogance, and the strength found in dignity. You'll learn that appearances can be deceiving, that treating people with cruelty can backfire spectacularly, and that true power doesn't need to announce itself. This story teaches us about respect, humility, and karma's perfect timing. After watching, please drop in the comments what lessons you learned from this story and what you would have done differently if you were in Emma's shoes when she was humiliated at that dinner. Don't forget to subscribe for more interesting, entertaining, and educative stories that deliver powerful life lessons you can apply to your own journey. Emma had spent 3 hours preparing for this evening, but her careful attention to every detail, from the emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair to the diamond earrings Derek had given her on their first anniversary, would soon prove tragically ironic. She arrived at Le Bernardin with butterflies in her stomach, genuinely believing her husband had planned something special for their 5th wedding anniversary, unaware that the surprise waiting for her would shatter everything she thought she knew about her marriage. The maître d' guided her to their reserved table with a knowing smile that she misinterpreted as warmth, but which actually concealed his discomfort at what he'd been instructed to facilitate that evening. Derek was already seated when Emma approached, his tailored Tom Ford suit making him look every bit the successful corporate executive he'd become. But his eyes held a coldness she'd never seen before, a glacial detachment that should have warned her something was fundamentally wrong. He didn't stand when she arrived, didn't compliment her appearance, didn't even smile, just gestured to the chair across from him with the casual indifference one might show a business associate rather than a wife. But Emma attributed his mood to work stress and settled into her seat with determined optimism. The waiter brought champagne that Emma hadn't ordered, but Derek had pre-selected, and she noticed Vanessa Richardson sitting 3 tables away, her husband's executive assistant, whose presence at their anniversary dinner seemed odd but not yet alarming. "In a happy anniversary, Emma," Derek said, his voice flat and rehearsed, lacking any warmth or genuine sentiment. But Emma raised her glass anyway, choosing to focus on the celebration rather than the growing unease in her stomach. They ordered appetizers through stilted conversation, Emma carrying the emotional weight of dialogue while Derek responded in monosyllables, his attention frequently drifting to Vanessa's table, where his mistress sat with barely concealed amusement. Emma tried to discuss their upcoming vacation plans, the charity gala she was organizing, their potential house renovation, normal conversations between married couples. But Derek's responses grew increasingly curt until finally, between the appetizer and main course, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a manila envelope. "I have something for you," Derek announced, sliding the envelope across the table with the same casualness one might use to share a dessert menu. but the weight of those papers would prove far heavier than their physical presence suggested. Emma's fingers hesitated before touching the envelope, some primal instinct warning her that opening it would change everything. But curiosity and trust, misplaced trust as it turned out, compelled her to break the seal and extract the documents inside. The words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," seemed to leap off the page in bold typeface, but Emma's brain struggled to process their meaning, reading the same line 3 times as if repetition might transform the words into something less devastating. "Derek, what is this?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise, but loud enough to catch the attention of nearby diners who sensed drama unfolding, though none yet understood its magnitude. Derek leaned back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction, his lips curling into something that approximated a smile, but contained no joy, only cruel triumph at having successfully orchestrated this public humiliation. "It's exactly what it looks like," he responded, his voice now carrying enough volume that Vanessa could hear from her table, which was precisely his intention, to perform this destruction for his mistress's entertainment. Vanessa's laugh cut through the restaurant's refined atmosphere like breaking glass, her champagne glass raised in Derek's direction in a toast to his cruelty. But neither she nor Derek registered the way Emma's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the way her shock was already crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. "You're divorcing me? On our anniversary? In public?" Emma's questions came in staccato bursts, each one seeking understanding in a situation that defied rational explanation, but Derek's response was to signal Vanessa to join them, his mistress rising from her table with theatrical grace, her Valentino dress and Cartier jewelry announcing her as the successor to Emma's position. "Emma, meet Vanessa, my real partner, the woman who actually understands success and ambition," Derek announced as Vanessa draped herself across his shoulders, her perfectly manicured fingers running possessively through his hair, while Emma sat frozen in disbelief. The surrounding tables had gone conspicuously quiet, other diners pretending not to watch while hanging on every word of the unfolding catastrophe, but none of them, not Derek, not Vanessa, not even the voyeuristic witnesses, understood that they were watching the opening act of a much larger drama. Emma's hands gripped the divorce papers so tightly the pages crumpled, but her face had gone eerily calm, a stillness that might have warned Derek if he'd been paying attention to anything beyond his own satisfaction. Emma stared at the divorce papers with an expression that had moved beyond shock into something unreadable, but before she could formulate a response, Derek's mother, Patricia, materialized beside their table like a storm cloud gaining human form. Patricia Harrison had never approved of Emma, viewing her daughter-in-law as beneath the family's social standing, despite the irony that Emma had consistently demonstrated more grace and dignity than Patricia ever had. But tonight, Patricia's disdain would escalate from passive aggression to physical violence in ways that would seal her fate alongside her son's. "Well, it's about time," Patricia declared, her voice dripping with vindictive satisfaction as she surveyed Emma's devastated expression, savoring the younger woman's pain with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. Patricia wore a St. John knit suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her gray hair styled in the severe updo she favored, her thin lips pressed into a line of perpetual disapproval, but her expensive exterior couldn't disguise the ugliness of her character. She placed one bony hand on Derek's shoulder in maternal support, her other hand gesturing dismissively at Emma, as if she were something unpleasant that needed to be swept away. "Mother, I'm handling this," Derek said, but his protest was half-hearted, clearly pleased by Patricia's reinforcement, even as he pretended to maintain control of the situation. Vanessa watched with gleeful interest, her arms still draped across Derek's shoulders, forming a trio of cruelty united against the woman who'd committed no crime beyond loving, unwisely, and trusting too completely. Emma remained seated, her hands now resting flat on the table, the divorce papers spread before her like evidence in a trial where she was simultaneously defendant and victim. "You need to sign those papers right now," Patricia commanded, leaning down so her face was inches from Emma's, her breath carrying the scent of the martini she'd consumed before arriving, but her eyes burned with a sobriety fueled by pure malice. Emma looked up at her mother-in-law with an expression that might have been mistaken for compliance, but which actually concealed calculations Patricia's limited emotional intelligence couldn't begin to comprehend. "I need time to review these with a lawyer," Emma responded quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her, maintaining her dignity even as three people actively worked to strip it away. The reasonableness of Emma's request apparently enraged Patricia beyond tolerance, her face flushing deep crimson as if Emma's refusal to be immediately destroyed represented an unforgivable defiance. But what happened next crossed a line that would prove impossible to uncross. Patricia's hand flew across Emma's face in a slap, so forceful that Emma's head snapped to the side, the crack of palm against cheek reverberating through the now silent restaurant like a gunshot, causing several diners to gasp audibly while others reached for their phones to either call for help or record the assault. Emma's cheek bloomed red with the outline of Patricia's fingers. But more shocking than the physical pain was the violation of being struck in public by someone who was supposed to be family. "You'll sign them now, you worthless gold digger!" Patricia shrieked, abandoning any pretense of refined behavior, her carefully constructed socialite facade shattering to reveal the cruelty beneath. She grabbed Emma's arm with surprising strength for a woman in her 60s, her nails digging into Emma's skin hard enough to leave crescent-shaped marks, physically hauling her from the chair with such violence that Emma's water glass toppled and shattered against the marble floor. Derek made no move to intervene, watching his mother assault his wife with passive acceptance, while Vanessa actually applauded, her champagne-fueled sense of invincibility blinding her to the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Get out of this restaurant! Get out of our lives," Patricia continued, now pushing Emma toward the exit. But when Emma stumbled on her evening heels, Patricia's foot connected with her shin in a kick that made Emma cry out, the physical assault escalating beyond slapping into something that bordered on battery. The restaurant manager finally moved to intervene, but Patricia's family had been patrons for decades, and his hesitation allowed the violence to continue for several more seconds, long enough for Emma to be forcibly propelled through the dining room, past staring diners, past the shocked maitre d', and out onto the cold Manhattan sidewalk, where she landed on her hands and knees. Her designer dress torn at the shoulder seam, her carefully styled hair disheveled, her dignity shredded by people who should have protected her. The restaurant door closed behind her with a decisive click, muffling the sound of Patricia's continued tirade and Vanessa's celebratory laughter, leaving Emma alone on the pavement as light rain began to fall, mixing with the tears that finally escaped down her bruised cheek. A passing couple averted their eyes, uncomfortable with witnessing someone's destruction, treating Emma's humiliation as something contagious they might catch if they acknowledged it. But their abandonment barely registered because Emma's mind had moved beyond the immediate trauma toward a calculation of consequences. She pushed herself to standing, ignoring the pain in her shin where Patricia's kick had connected, ignoring the stares of passers-by who'd witnessed a well-dressed woman being literally kicked out of an upscale restaurant. Emma reached into her small evening clutch with trembling fingers, but not to call a friend for comfort or a lawyer for advice. Instead, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts to a name that would mean nothing to most people, but represented absolute power in certain circles. She pressed dial, lifting the phone to her ear as rain continued to fall, her voice remarkably steady when someone answered on the second ring. "James, it's Emma," she said quietly, using her full legal name rather than the shortened version Derek had always preferred, reclaiming her identity with those two words. "I need you to execute Protocol 7 immediately. Full implementation, no warnings, effective within the hour." The person on the other end, James Whitmore, though Emma didn't need to explain who he was or what authority he wielded, apparently asked for confirmation because Emma repeated herself with absolute clarity, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, full implementation, Derek Harrison, Patricia Harrison, and Vanessa Richardson. All contractual relationships terminated, all pending deals canceled, all corporate access revoked. And James," she paused, her eyes hardening as she looked back at the restaurant's glowing windows where her destroyers were probably toasting their victory, "initiate the secondary consequences we discussed for extreme scenarios. They wanted to destroy me publicly. Let's show them what real destruction looks like. She ended the call and stood in the rain for another moment, but no longer as a victim, as someone who just unleashed forces her attackers couldn't begin to comprehend, forces that were already moving through digital networks and corporate hierarchies, dismantling lives with the efficiency of a surgical strike. Emma hailed a taxi, sliding into the back seat without looking back at Le Bernardin, leaving behind the woman she'd been and embracing the power she'd kept hidden for 5 years. Hidden so well that even her husband had never suspected that his unassuming wife was actually the person who controlled his entire professional future. Derek raised his glass in triumph as Emma's taxi disappeared into Manhattan traffic, completely oblivious to the fact that his celebratory toast marked the beginning of his professional execution rather than his liberation. But his ignorance would last only another 17 minutes before reality came crashing down with devastating force. Vanessa had moved into Emma's vacated chair, her lipstick leaving marks on Derek's champagne flute as they shared drinks, while Patricia settled into a third seat, the trio forming a twisted family unit bound by cruelty and mutual congratulation. The restaurant manager had quietly comped their meals as an apology for the disturbance, treating Emma's assault as an inconvenience to other diners, rather than the crime it actually was, but his complicity would prove costly when lawyers arrived in the coming weeks. "I can't believe you stayed married to that pathetic woman for 5 years, Vanessa purred, running her fingers along Derek's jaw while Patricia nodded approvingly, the three of them reveling in their victory without any awareness that Emma's phone call had already set machinery in motion that would grind them to dust. Derek launched into a self-aggrandizing speech about how he'd only married Emma because she'd seemed safe and manageable, how he'd always planned to upgrade once his career reached a certain level. Horror conveniently rewriting history to paint himself as a strategic genius, rather than acknowledging that Emma had actually supported him through business school, through his early career struggles, through every setback that had preceded his recent success. And now you're free to focus on what really matters. The Titanium Industries deal, Patricia added, her eyes glittering with greed as she contemplated the social elevation Derek's $8.4 billion contract would bring their family, envisioning country club memberships and charity board positions that had previously been just beyond her reach. The Titanium Industries deal represented Derek's crowning achievement, a merger so massive it would reshape the tech industry's landscape. Is scheduled to be finalized in just 48 hours with signatures that would make Derek one of the youngest senior executives in corporate America. What none of them knew, what they couldn't have known because Emma had deliberately obscured her identity, was that Titanium Industries' majority shareholder and ultimate decision-maker was currently sitting in a taxi heading uptown, her bruised face and torn dress hiding a power that dwarfed anything Derek had ever achieved. Derek's phone buzzed at exactly 9:47 p.m., but he ignored it, too engrossed in Vanessa's attention and his mother's praise to be bothered by what he assumed was a routine work message. Yet the notification represented the first domino falling in a cascade that would flatten his entire existence. The phone buzzed again, then again, the frequency increasing until even Vanessa noticed and suggested he check it, her tone carrying mild irritation that his device was interrupting their celebration. Derek finally glanced at his screen, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, confusion replacing confidence as he read a message from his CEO requesting an immediate phone call regardless of the hour. "I need to take this," Derek muttered, standing from the table with his phone pressed to his ear, moving toward the restaurant's entrance where the noise level would allow for clearer conversation. But his posture grew increasingly rigid as he listened to whatever was being communicated. Patricia and Vanessa watched through the window as Derek's animated gestures suggested distress. His free hand running through his hair repeatedly, a nervous habit he displayed only under extreme stress. But they assumed some minor business complication that he'd resolve with his usual combination of charm and competence. When Derek returned to the table 3 minutes later, his face had gone ashen, all color drained away as if he'd received news of a death, which in a sense he had. The death of his career, his reputation, and his future. "The Titanium deal is dead," Derek announced, his voice hollow with shock, sinking back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support his weight. But this revelation was only the opening salvo in his destruction. Patricia's hand flew to her chest in theatrical dismay, while Vanessa's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, shone in the first glimmers of fear as she began to understand that proximity to Derek's disaster might contaminate her own position. "What do you mean dead? The contracts were finalized. The board approved everything." Patricia's voice rose sharply, drawing attention from nearby tables who'd witnessed the earlier assault and now sensed a reversal of fortune that satisfied their sense of cosmic justice. Derek explained in fragmented sentences that Titanium Industries had unilaterally canceled the merger, invoking a clause that allowed termination without cause, but with significant financial penalties that Derek's company would now have to absorb. Penalties that would likely trigger his immediate termination since he championed the deal despite internal opposition. But the cancellation itself wasn't even the worst part. His CEO had also informed him that Titanium's legal team was filing a lawsuit alleging that Derek had misrepresented his authority and credentials during negotiations, claims that were technically untrue, but which Titanium had enough legal firepower to make stick regardless of factual accuracy. The lawsuit would make Derek unemployable in the industry, even if he somehow survived the immediate fallout. His name permanently associated with the biggest failed deal in recent corporate history. "This doesn't make sense," Vanessa said, her voice climbing toward panic as she realized the implications for her own career. Having positioned herself as Derek's right hand and romantic partner, tying her professional future to his in ways that now seemed catastrophically short-sighted. Derek's phone rang again, and this time it was Human Resources requesting his presence at an emergency disciplinary hearing scheduled for 7 a.m. the following morning. Corporate speak for a termination meeting where he'd be stripped of his credentials and escorted from the building by security. Patricia had gone silent, her mind clearly calculating how this disaster would affect her social standing, how she'd explain to her country club friends that her son's meteoric rise had become a spectacular crash. "There's more," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared at another incoming message. This one informing him that his corporate credit cards had been suspended, his company car recalled, his stock options voided, and his access to company systems terminated effective immediately. The complete dismantling of a corporate executive happening in real time through text messages and phone calls. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, with a sound like a small scream, her survival instincts overriding any loyalty she might have pretended to feel for Derek. "I need to go," she announced, gathering her designer purse and coat with shaking hands, already distancing herself from the wreckage, already crafting the narrative she'd tell colleagues about how she'd been deceived by Derek's false promises. "Vanessa, wait." Derek reached for her arm, but she jerked away from his touch as if it might burn her, her eyes cold with the same calculation she displayed when mocking Emma just an hour earlier. Except now Derek was the target of her contempt rather than her co-conspirator. She fled the restaurant without another word, leaving Derek and Patricia sitting in the stunned silence as the full magnitude of their situation began to crystallize, though they still had no understanding of how or why their world had collapsed so suddenly and so completely. Derek's phone continued buzzing with incoming notifications, each one bringing fresh catastrophe. Professional contacts removing him from their networks, colleagues posting veiled references to his failure on social media, journalists requesting comments about the Titanium deal's cancellation. Patricia finally broke the silence with a question that revealed how completely she'd misunderstood everything. Could Emma have done this somehow? Could she have contacts at Titanium? Her tone suggested the idea was absurd even as she voiced it, unable to conceive that the woman she'd just assaulted might wield the kind of power necessary to orchestrate such comprehensive destruction. Derek dismissed the notion immediately, explaining that Emma had no connections in the corporate world, that she was just a housewife who occasionally volunteered at charity events, revealing how thoroughly Emma had hidden her true identity even from the man who'd shared her bed for 5 years. But as Derek's phone continued its relentless buzzing with fresh disasters, a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind, a possibility so outrageous he barely dared consider it, yet couldn't entirely dismiss. What if Emma wasn't who he thought she was? Sorry, what if the unassuming woman he'd just divorced and humiliated was actually someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The thought seemed impossible, contradicting everything he believed he knew about his wife. But the timing was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to be mere coincidence. And Derek felt the first cold fingers of genuine fear closing around his heart as he began to understand that he might have made a mistake far worse than he could possibly have comprehended. The next morning arrived with the kind of cruel sunshine that seemed to mock Derek's devastation. But his sleepless night had only been a prelude to horrors he couldn't yet imagine, horrors that began materializing when he received a certified letter at 6 a.m., informing him that his termination had been accelerated and his severance package voided due to gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Patricia had spent the night at Derek's apartment, her own marriage having deteriorated years ago to the point where she essentially lived independently from Derek's father, and together mother and son sat in his living room surrounded by the trappings of success that were already being repossessed. The furniture he'd leased, the artwork he'd financed, the luxury he'd built on credit and future promises that had evaporated overnight. Derek's bank account had been frozen pending investigation into allegations of corporate espionage, completely fabricated charges, but ones that Titanium Industries' legal team had documented with such meticulous detail that defending against them would cost more than Derek could possibly afford, effectively bearing him under legal fees regardless of the ultimate verdict. Patricia's own finances, heavily dependent on Derek's income and future prospects, were equally compromised, her credit cards declining that morning when she tried to purchase coffee, the small humiliation foreshadowing much larger indignities to come. They sat in stunned silence until Derek's phone rang again, this time with a number he didn't recognize, but which he answered with the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might offer a lifeline. "Mr. Harrison, this is James Whitmore, Woody General Counsel for Titanium Industries," the voice on the other end announced with professional courtesy that concealed absolute ruthlessness beneath its polished surface. And Derek's heart sank further because he understood that general counsels didn't make personal calls to deliver good news. James explained in precise legal language that Titanium Industries was prepared to drop all charges and lawsuits on one condition: that Derek and his mother Patricia report to Le Bernardin restaurant that evening to begin employment as dishwashers, positions that had been specially created for them at minimum wage, with their employment contract binding them to 1 year of service with no early termination, permitted without incurring additional financial penalties of $5 million each. "This is insane. You can't force us to work as dishwashers. I'll sue for wrongful termination, for defamation, for..." Derek's protests came out in a rush of indignation, his legal threats hollow given his current position. But James interrupted with the kind of patience one might show a child who doesn't understand basic mathematics. "Mr. Harrison, let me clarify your situation," James continued, his voice never losing its professional tone despite delivering information that would destroy Derek's remaining dignity. "You currently face approximately $47 million in legal judgments, penalties, and damages across multiple lawsuits. Your personal assets total approximately $340,000, meaning bankruptcy would still leave you liable for the remainder, garnishing any future wages for the rest of your natural life. The alternative James presented was simple: accept the dishwashing positions, work for 1 year at minimum wage, and at the end of that period, all legal actions would be dismissed, all penalties waived, allowing Derek and Patricia to rebuild their lives from zero rather than from $47 million in debt. The choice wasn't really a choice at all, but rather the illusion of agency in a situation where every option led to destruction except for the path of complete humiliation that had been carefully constructed for them. Derek tried to ask who had orchestrated this, who had the power and motivation to craft such an elaborate punishment, but James simply responded that all relevant information would be provided once they reported for their first shift at 6 p.m. that evening. Patricia grabbed the phone from Derek's hand, her voice shrill with outrage as she demanded to speak to James's superior, threatening legal action and social consequences and everything her limited imagination could conjure. But James simply waited for her tirade to exhaust itself before repeating the terms with identical phrasing, as if her fury was merely background noise that didn't merit acknowledgement. When Patricia finally fell silent, James added one final detail that made Derek's blood run cold. "Oh, and Mr. Harrison, you might be interested to know that your former wife Emma sends her regards, though she prefers to be addressed by her full legal name, Emma Catherine Thornton, a majority shareholder and CEO of Titanium Industries." The phone call ended with that revelation hanging in the air, like a bomb that had detonated after a delayed fuse. The truth finally exploding into Derek's consciousness with devastating force that left him unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to process that the woman he'd humiliated, the woman his mother had assaulted, was actually one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful people who'd been living among them in disguise for 5 years. Patricia's face had gone from red to white, all her aristocratic pretensions crumbling as she understood that she'd slapped a trillionaire, that she'd kicked and cursed someone who could, and clearly would, destroy her without breaking a sweat. Why would she hide that? Why would someone with that much money and power pretend to be a normal housewife? Patricia whispered. But Derek suddenly understood with painful clarity that Emma had been testing him, testing whether he could love someone for who they were rather than what they could provide. And he'd failed that test so spectacularly that his failure would now be commemorated in 1 year of washing dishes in the very restaurant where he'd betrayed her. The cruelty of Emma's revenge was perfectly calibrated, not illegal, not physically harmful, but psychologically devastating in its precision, forcing Derek and Patricia to serve the wealthy patrons they'd once considered peers, stripping away their dignity one greasy plate at a time. That evening, Derek and Patricia stood in Le Bernardin's industrial kitchen, wearing stained aprons and hairnets. Their hands already raw from the harsh detergent and scalding water, their backs aching from standing at steel sinks, while their former social equals dined in the restaurant beyond the kitchen doors. The other kitchen staff treated them with the kind of wary distance one might show a disease, understanding that Derek and Patricia were there as punishment rather than choice, their presence a cautionary tale about the dangers of cruelty and arrogance. The head chef, a man who'd witnessed Emma's assault and had felt sick about his own complicity in not intervening more forcefully, now oversaw Derek and Patricia's labor with grim satisfaction, assigning them the most unpleasant tasks and offering no sympathy when they struggled. During their first break, when Derek made the mistake of checking his phone and discovered that news of his fall had spread through his professional network with the speed of wildfire, former colleagues expressing shock and schadenfreude in equal measure, his reputation so thoroughly destroyed that rebuilding it would take years if it was even possible at all. Patricia sat on a milk crate in the alley behind the restaurant, her designer clothes replaced with kitchen whites, her manicured hands blistered and bleeding, crying tears that mixed with the grime on her face, while Derek stood nearby in similar condition, both of them understanding that this was only day 1 of 365 days of this existence. They'd wanted to destroy Emma publicly, to humiliate her in front of witnesses, to strip away her dignity. And Emma had responded by giving them exactly what they'd given her, and amplified by the power they'd been too blind and too arrogant to see she possessed. As Derek returned to his station and plunged his hands back into the gray, greasy water filled with the remnants of meals he could no longer afford to eat, he thought about the divorce papers Emma had never signed, papers that now seemed like relics from another universe, where he'd believed himself powerful and her powerless. He understood now that Emma would never sign those papers during this year of punishment, that she would drag out the divorce until after he'd learned his lesson, and that even when she finally granted him freedom, he would spend the rest of his life knowing that the best thing that ever happened to him had been the woman he destroyed for sport. Patricia worked silently at the adjacent sink, her own thoughts presumably running along similar lines, both of them washing dishes while the woman they'd assaulted made decisions worth billions of dollars in offices high above the city. The contrast between their positions now and Emma's position serving as a permanent reminder that cruelty always carries consequences. Sometimes gentle, sometimes devastating, but always inevitable for those foolish enough to mistake kindness for weakness and dignity for vulnerability. Moral lessons. 1. Never underestimate anyone based on appearances. Emma's quiet demeanor hid immense power and intelligence. 2. Treat everyone with respect and dignity. Derek and Patricia's cruelty boomeranged with devastating force. 3. Humility is essential regardless of success. Derek's arrogance blinded him to reality. 4. Well, public humiliation has public consequences. They destroyed Emma publicly and were destroyed publicly in return. 5. True power doesn't need to announce itself. Emma's hidden identity proved more powerful than Derek's displayed status. 6. Character matters more than status. Emma maintained dignity even in humiliation. Derek revealed his cruelty in triumph. 7. Karma's timing is perfect. Consequences may not be immediate, but they are inevitable. 8. Actions have lasting consequences. 1 year of punishment will affect them for a lifetime. Dear viewers, I hope this story has shown you the importance of treating every person with respect, the danger of judging people by appearances, and the inevitable consequences of cruelty. Remember that true power lies not in humiliating others, but in maintaining your dignity and character regardless of circumstances. Please drop in the comments what lessons you learned from this story and what you would have done differently if you were in Emma's position when she was betrayed and assaulted at that dinner. Don't forget to subscribe for more interesting, entertaining, and educative stories that will inspire you and teach you valuable life lessons.